Dr. Elmendorf, when the stimulus bill was passed, it was widely believed that unemployment would go down because of that stimulus program. But here we are 3.5 years later, and we had a peak to 10% unemployment. We've had about 40 months of employment higher than 8%. The other side of the aisle is proposing to continue to have another round of stimulus. They've changed the name to investment, and saying that's going to be the panacea to solve our deficits and to solve our debt problem that we have in this country that you've done a great job of explaining. My question is this: can you explain in about 30 seconds or less why the stimulus didn't achieve its desired outcomes and what impact it's had on our debt and deficits?
So the economy has performed a good deal worse than we expected and many forecasters expected a few years ago. In our assessment, and the assessment of most economists, I think, the Recovery Act created more output and more employment than would have happened without it. But the underlying weakness of the economy, not unusual in comparison to other countries that have had financial crisis-induced recessions, but unusual for us, the other underlying weakness of the economy has more than offset the efforts of fiscal policymakers and monetary policymakers.
So that takes
the economy back on a strong course.
That takes us to the next question, and I've asked this question before. What is more efficient in terms of causing increasing economic activity? Is it public sector spending or private sector spending? I mean, in other words, it's a choice between a Solyndra expenditure or a Keystone expenditure. Which of those is better for the economy?
Well, we haven't studied those two particular types.
But they're the poster children, so let's talk about it because they're the poster.
In an economy where the constraint on output and employment is weak demand for goods and services, which is the economy that we've been living through for the past 4.5 years, then additional demand from the private sector or from the government will raise output, raise employment relative to what would otherwise occur.
And what causes that increased demand? What is it? I mean, under that thinking that public sector spending can raise demand, I mean, then you would have had a $4 trillion stimulus or a $5 trillion stimulus. But of course, the impact on the economy would have been tragic because of its impact on federal deficits and debt. So isn't it better to rely on private sector spending for economic stimulative activity? Well, wouldn't you want to do things that encourage private sector investment in jobs in our economy and paychecks than public sector spending?
Well, Congressman, we've been clear that the extra debt that was accumulated through the Recovery Act, if not offset by other policy changes later, will lead to an ongoing level of higher debt that will, in the medium term and long term, be a drag on the economy.
Correct. So we wouldn't want to.
Short term, I think policymakers have tried to both stimulate private spending and to increase public spending.
So it would be inappropriate to double down in terms of a failed program to continue. If the stimulus version 1.0 worked, why would stimulus version 2.0 work any better?
But Congressman, as you understand, and I recognize you don't agree with us, but our position is that the Recovery Act was not a failed program. Our position is that it created higher output and employment than would have occurred without it. And we did analysis last fall in testimony to the Senate Budget Committee of a collection of alternative proposals, some tax increases, some tax cuts, some spending increases that we think would spur output and employment.
What would have had a higher impact if you'd had $700 billion of additional GDP from the private sector versus $700 billion of GDP, or spending from the public sector? Which would have had greater impact on the economy?
Well, over the past few years, Congressman, that extra spending, wherever it came from, would have led to more jobs. And there's no reason to think that the extra spending in the private sector would lead to more additional jobs than extra spending in the public sector. Over a longer period of time, the question is, what sorts of goods and services have been purchased? And if the public sector was investing, then that would be good. And if the private sector was investing, that would be good in the long run.
Thank you.
Okay. That was fascinating.
Reach a general conclusion.
Time's getting here.